The year is 1922. The setting is not the bustling, familiar streets of Shanghai, but the damp, cobblestone fog of Cambridge, England. Imagine the scene. It is the height of the Roaring Twenties. The Western world is dancing to the rhythm of jazz, celebrating the end of the Great War with a desperate, frantic energy. Women in London and New York are cutting their hair into bobs, smoking cigarettes in long holders, and demanding the right to vote. It is an era of explosive, intoxicating freedom. But walking down a gray, indifferent street in Cambridge is a woman who feels none of this freedom. She is Chinese, barely in her early 20s, and heavily, visibly pregnant. Her coat is pulled tight against the damp English chill, but the cold she feels inside is far more biting than the wind. She is holding a piece of paper that her husband has just forced into her hands. It is a divorce agreement. Her husband is Xu Zhimo, a man who would go on to be celebrated as China's greatest romantic poet, the Chinese equivalent of a Lord Byron or a Shelley. He was a man who preached eloquently about universal love, freedom of the soul, and the liberation of the individual. Yet, looking at his pregnant wife, his muse completely deserted him. He had no poetry for her, no verses of compassion. He had only a brutal ultimatum. Sign this now. When she hesitated, confused and terrified by the prospect of being cast aside in a foreign land, he gave her a reason that would slice through history like a knife. He looked at her traditional demeanor, her quiet posture, and he sneered, "Small feet do not match a Western suit. This woman is Zhang Youyi." In that moment, she was the discarded artifact of a changing world. In an era where men chased modernity by abandoning their traditional responsibilities, she became a statistic, the first woman in modern Chinese history to undergo a so-called civilized divorce. By all the social scripts of the 1920s, her life was effectively over. A divorced woman? With a child? In that conservative society? She was expected to vanish into the shadows, consumed by shame, living out her days as a cautionary tale of a failed marriage. She was supposed to be the dust that history swept away. But Zhang Youyi didn't read that script. Decades later, the poet who abandoned her in the name of abstract freedom would die in a fiery plane crash, exhausted, penniless, and chasing a romantic illusion. And the woman he called a country bumpkin? She would rise from the ashes of that abandonment to become the most formidable female banker in Shanghai, a fashion mogul who dictated style to the elite, and the iron matriarch who held her entire family together through war and revolution. Welcome to Fanko Decodes. I am Fanko. Today, we are stepping deep into the life of Zhang Youyi. This is not just a biography. It is a decoding of the human spirit. Her story serves as a mirror for anyone who has ever felt not good enough, anyone who has been traded like a commodity, abandoned or underestimated. As we walk through her 89-year odyssey, we will confront three profound questions that transcend culture and time. First, in the battle between family responsibility and personal freedom, how do we find a balance? Second, when the architecture of your life is demolished by betrayal, how do you build a skyscraper from the rubble? Third, how do you navigate relationships with people who use you and hurt you without losing your own soul? And eventually, how do you turn that very relationship into a resource? Zhang Youyi teaches us that true strength isn't found in the loud rebellion of the poet, nor in the luck of the innocent. It is found in the quiet, unyielding stoicism of the survivor. Chapter 1. The Transaction. A merger disguised as a marriage. To understand the tragedy, we must travel back to the spring of 1915, to a girls' normal school in Jiangsu province. 15-year-old Zhang Youyi is sitting in a classroom, her eyes focused on the blackboard. She is a diligent student, absorbing knowledge, perhaps dreaming of a future where she could be a teacher or an educator. The world outside is changing, but inside the classroom, there is order. Suddenly, a messenger interrupts the class. "Zhang Youyi, you are needed at home." Immediately. Her heart racing, she rushes back to her family's estate in Baoshan, Shanghai. She expects an emergency, perhaps an illness, or a death in the family. Instead, she walks into a boardroom meeting disguised as a family gathering. The entire Zhang clan is buzzing with excitement. Her fourth brother, Zhang Youyi, who is already a rising star in China's political and financial sphere, beckons her over. He is holding a photograph. "Look at this," he says, his voice thick with pride. "This is the son of the Xu family from Xiaxi, the only son of Xu Shenru. They are incredibly wealthy, titans of industry. And the boy? He is brilliant. His essays are renowned. He is a scholar." In the grainy black and white photo, a young man stares back. He wears gold-rimmed glasses and exudes an air of scholarly arrogance. This is Xu Zhimo. Zhang Youyi stares at the face of the stranger. She is 15. She doesn't know what love is. She doesn't know what marriage really means. But looking at her brother's face, she knows one thing. The Zhang family needs this. To the Western ear, this sounds like a forced marriage. But we must understand the nuance here. This was a power alliance. The Zhang family possessed immense political clout and social status, what Chinese culture calls shi, power. The Xu family possessed vast industrial fortune, cai, wealth. In the eyes of the elders, combining the Zhang's political influence with the Zhus money was not a romance. It was a merger, an acquisition strategy designed to fortify both dynasties against the chaos of the era. In this high-stakes game of family chess, 15-year-old Zhang Youyi and 18-year-old Xu Zhimo were not human beings with complex feelings. They were pawns. They were the ink used to sign the contract. But there was a problem, one that Zhang Youyi didn't know about until it was too late. Xu Zhimo, the young man in the photo, had already seen a picture of her, and his reaction was brutal. Xu was a radical. He had been drinking deep from the well of Western romanticism. He believed in free love, in soulmates, in electric passion. He saw the arranged marriage as a feudal chain around his neck. When he saw Zhang Youyi's photo, a serious, traditional-looking girl, he didn't see a potential partner. He saw an enemy. He sneered to his friends, uttering a line that would haunt her for years. "She is a country bumpkin with dirt in her nose. I have absolutely no interest in her." Think about the cruelty of that statement. He hadn't spoken to her. He hadn't heard her laugh. He judged her solely as a symbol of the old China he wanted to destroy. His rebellion against his parents was valid, but the price of his rebellion would be paid entirely by an innocent 15-year-old girl. And here is a twist of fate. Originally, Zhang Youyi wasn't even the intended bride. Her older sister was. But in traditional Chinese culture, the stars must align. A fortune teller was consulted. The mystic warned that the eldest daughter's astrological sign was too strong, that she would curse her husband if she married before the age of 25. The families, terrified of risking their investment in this alliance, turned their eyes to the younger sister. A spare heir, the replacement. When told she would take her sister's place, Zhang Youyi didn't scream. She didn't fight. She stood before her family and simply said, "I am willing to bear this responsibility for the family." This wasn't weakness. This was the profound dignity and stoicism of her upbringing. She accepted her duty. October 1915. The wedding took place in Xiaxi. It was a lavish affair, filled with gold and red silk, the colors of joy and prosperity. But for the bride, it was a funeral procession. Throughout the ceremony, Xu Zhimo was a block of ice. He refused to smile. He went through the rituals like a prisoner marching to the gallows. He wanted everyone to know he was unhappy. Zhang Youyi felt the humiliation burning her skin. She was educated. She was from a prestigious family. How had she become a country bumpkin in his eyes? But she was 15. She had no voice. She swallowed the shame and entered the Xu household. Marriage to Xu Zhimo was not a partnership. It was solitary confinement. He treated her with what modern psychologists call stonewalling. He didn't beat her. He simply erased her. He barely spoke to her. They lived in the same room, breathed the same air, yet were worlds apart. The only warmth came from his parents. The elders thus adored her. They saw her diligence, her kindness, her intelligence. She managed the household flawlessly, serving her parents-in-law with absolute devotion, trying to earn her place in the world through service. In 1918, she gave birth to their first son, Xu Zhimo. Holding the baby, Zhang Youyi felt a flicker of hope. Surely, she thought, a child will bridge the gap. Now we are a family. Now he will see me. She was tragically wrong. For Xu Zhimo, the child was not a bond. It was a shackle. Barely weeks after his son was born, Xu made an announcement. I am leaving. He claimed he needed to study to broaden his horizons in Tianjin, in Beijing. His logic was high-minded, but his actions were clear. He was running away. He left his 18-year-old wife to care for his aging parents and his screaming infant, while he went to play the role of the intellectual bohemian in the capital. For Zhang Youyi, the long night of waiting began. Occasionally, letters would arrive. They were thick with descriptions of his life, his studies, his philosophy, but they were addressed to his parents. He never asked, "How is my wife?" He never asked, "How is she coping?" She was a ghost in his narrative. Then he went further. In 1920, he left for America. Then, in 1921, he crossed the Atlantic to England to study at Cambridge. The distance grew from miles to oceans. Zhang Youyi began to accept her fate. She was a married widow. But fate wasn't done with her. In the autumn of 1921, a letter arrived that would change the trajectory of her life. It was from Xu Zhimo, and for the first time, it was addressed to her. Will you come to England to join me? Why? Why now? Had he changed? Had he realized her worth? Zhang Youyi's heart was a mix of anxiety and excitement. This was her second chance. She hired a tutor. She tried to learn English etiquette. She told herself, when he sees me this time, I will not be the country bumpkin. I will be worthy. She kissed her son goodbye, leaving him with her in-laws, and boarded a steamship for the long, treacherous journey to Europe. She stood on the deck, watching the ocean churn, unaware that she was sailing not into a reunion, but into a storm that would strip her of everything she thought she was. Chapter 2. The Awakening in a Foreign Land, Winter 1921. London. The ship docked in the gray mist. Zhang Youyi stood by the railing, her eyes scanning the crowd on the pier. She was looking for a smile, a wave, a husband who missed her. She found him, but the look on his face stopped her cold. Xu Zhimo stood there, not with open arms, but with his hands in his pockets. His face was a mask of impatience and embarrassment. He looked at her as if she were a piece of unwanted luggage that had unfortunately arrived. He didn't hug her. He didn't even help with her heavy bags. He simply said, flatly, "You're here." What made it worse were the people around him. He had brought friends westernized, intellectual friends. He chatted with them in fluent, rapid-fire English, laughing, debating. Zhang Youyi stood there, silent, understanding nothing, isolated in a crowd. He didn't introduce her. He was ashamed of her. When they arrived at his apartment, there was no welcome home dinner. Instead, the first thing he did was criticize her appearance. "You look ridiculous," he told her. "That outfit is so provincial. You are going to embarrass me in front of my friends." He dragged her to a department store in London. He forced her to buy Western clothes dresses that felt strange and revealing to her. "Put this on," he commanded. When she emerged, wearing the Western fashion, he nodded. Not with approval for her, but approval for the disguise. They took a photo together, the only photo of them as a couple during this time. But Zhang realized quickly this photo wasn't a memory. It was a prop. He mailed it back to his parents in China to say, "Look, we are happy. Keep sending money." Living in a cramped apartment near Cambridge, Zhang Youyi discovered a new level of loneliness. Xu Zhimo was physically present, but emotionally he was on another planet. He was living the high life of a Cambridge intellectual, drinking tea with philosophers, writing poetry about clouds and rivers. He came home late. He was irritable. And he was receiving letters, many letters, written in English, scented with perfume. A woman's intuition is a powerful thing. Zhang Youyi knew. She investigated. She asked around. And the truth shattered her. Lin Huiyan. Her husband had fallen madly, obsessively in love with Lin Huiyan, the brilliant, beautiful daughter of a Chinese diplomat. Lin Huiyan was everything Zhang was not. She spoke English, she understood poetry, she was modern. She was the dream. Zhang Youyi was the reality he wanted to wake up from. Then came the breaking point, the moment that reveals the true darkness beneath Xu Zhimo's romantic exterior. It was August 1922. Zhang Youyi, trembling, approached her husband. "Zhimo," she said softly, I am pregnant." She was carrying his second child. In any normal marriage, this is a moment of joy. Even in a bad marriage, it is usually a moment of responsibility. Xu Zhimo didn't look up from his book. He simply said, "Get an abortion." Zhang Youyi froze. The room spun. "Abortion?" She whispered. "We must remember the context. This is 1922. Abortion was illegal. It was performed in back alleys. It was life-threatening. But double quotes, she stammered, tears welling up. I have heard I have heard that abortion is dangerous. People die from it." Xu Zhimo stood up. He looked his wife, the mother of his child, in the eye, and delivered a line so cold it chills the blood a century later. "People die in train accidents all the time. Have you ever seen anyone stop riding trains because of it? Let that sink in." He compared the life of his wife and unborn child to a commuter taking a risk on public transport. To him, her life was a statistic, an inconvenience. This wasn't just a lack of love. This was a complete lack of humanity. He was so blinded by his pursuit of romantic freedom that he had become a monster of selfishness. A few days later, the final insult arrived. Xu brought a female guest to dinner. This woman was a paradox. She had bound feet, the ultimate symbol of feudal oppression, but she was dressed in the latest Western fashion. After she left, Xu turned to Zhang Youyi with a manic glint in his eye. "What did you think of her?" he asked. Zhang answered honestly. She looked nice, but the small feet didn't match the Western suit. It looked incongruous. Xu Zhimo seized on her words like a lawyer in a courtroom. "Exactly," he shouted. "That is us, don't you see? You are the small feet. I am the Western suit. We do not match. We are incongruous." He weaponized her own observation against her. He turned a fashion critique into a divorce decree. And then he vanished. He packed a bag and left. He left his pregnant wife alone in a foreign country, with limited English, no income, and a broken heart. Panic set in. Zhang Youyi was alone in the vastness of Europe. She wrote a desperate letter to her second brother, Zhang Youyi, who was studying in Paris. He was a scholar, a man of logic. "What do I do?" she begged. "Zhimo wants a divorce. I am pregnant." Her brother's reply was a crushing blow of reality. He wrote, "For the Zhang family to lose Xu Zhimo, it is a tragedy equal to losing our parents." Even her own brother mourned the loss of the famous brother-in-law more than the pain of his sister. But he added a lifeline. "Do not abort the child. Come to Paris. I will support you." She packed her bags. She traveled to Paris, then to Germany. In Berlin, the winter of 1922 was brutal. She entered a hospital to give birth. Alone. While other women had husbands pacing the hallways, Zhang Youyi had only her shadow. She gave birth to her second son, Peter. As she lay in the hospital bed, exhausted, weak, holding her newborn, a visitor arrived. It was Xu Zhimo. He didn't come to see the baby. He didn't come to ask if she was okay. He came with a piece of paper. "Sign this," he said. "The divorce agreement." He was in a rush. He needed the divorce finalized so he could pursue Lin Huihan. He was chasing his soulmate, and his wife and newborn son were just obstacles to be cleared. Zhang Youyi looked at the man she had tried so hard to please. She looked at the philosopher who compared her death to a train accident. She looked at the paper. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The old Zhang Youyi, the one who obeyed, who waited, who begged, died in that hospital bed. She realized, why am I holding on to a man who treats me like garbage? Why does my value depend on his approval? She picked up the pen. "I will sign," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. She signed her name. Xu Zhimo grabbed the paper. He was ecstatic. He thanked her profusely, babbling about how she had freed him, how she was a modern woman now. He barely glanced at the baby, his own flesh and blood. He ran out of the hospital room, chasing his dream. Zhang Youyi was left in the silence of the ward. She held Peter close. "I don't want a daughter," she whispered to the empty room. "I never want a daughter to experience what I have just gone through." She was a divorcee, a single mother, an exile in Germany. She had lost her marriage. She had lost her social status. But as the snow fell outside the window, Zhang Youyi made a vow. She would not go back to China to hide in shame. She would not be the victim. She would stay in Europe. She would learn German. She would go to university. She would take the wreckage of her life and build something that Xu Zhimo could never tear down. The country bumpkin was gone. The matriarch was about to be born. Chapter 3. The Phoenix Rises 1923 to 1925. While Xu Zhimo was back in China, enjoying his fame as a literary celebrity, Zhang Youyi was fighting a war for survival in Germany. Berlin in the 1920s was a tough place. Inflation was rampant. Zhang Youyi, a single mother living in a foreign land, had to learn the value of every single coin. She later recalled a vivid memory, sitting at her kitchen table, counting potatoes. She would divide her weekly supply of potatoes into piles. This pile is for Monday. This pile is for Tuesday. If she was hungry on Monday, she couldn't touch Tuesday's pile. If she did, she would starve later in the week. Think about the contrast. She came from a wealthy family in Shanghai. She married into a wealthy family. But here she was, rationing potatoes like a refugee. But this poverty was a gift. It stripped away her entitlement. It taught her resourcefulness. It taught her the value of discipline, something the poetic, flighty Xu Zhimo never learned. She studied fiercely. She mastered the German language. She studied early childhood education. She was rebuilding her mind, brick by brick. Just as life seemed to be stabilizing, fate dealt Zhang Youyi the cruelest blow imaginable. Spring 1925. Her son, Peter, the child born in loneliness, the child who was her only companion in exile, fell ill. It was a gut infection. In 1925, this was a death sentence. Zhang Youyi watched helplessly as her 3-year-old son faded away. On March 19, 1925, Peter died. Her world collapsed. The child was the reason she endured. He was the anchor. Now, the anchor was gone. But in this darkest moment, something unexpected happened. Xu Zhimo received the news in Europe. He traveled to Berlin. For the first time in their entire relationship, he didn't come as a critic. He didn't come as an arrogant poet. He came as a father. He saw the tiny coffin, He saw the ashes, and he saw the immense suffering etched onto his ex-wife's face. Xu Zhimo wept. He held the urn and cried uncontrollably. In that funeral parlor, amidst the shared tears, the ice between them finally melted. Zhang Youyi realized something profound. He wasn't a monster. He was just a weak, flawed, emotional man. Seeing his vulnerability, her hatred evaporated. You cannot hate something you pity. By burying her son, she also buried her resentment. She was now completely free. In 1926, Zhang Youyi returned to Shanghai. She left as a rejected, traditional wife. She returned as a German-speaking, independent, modern woman who had survived hell. Shanghai in the late 1920s was the Paris of the East. It was a booming metropolis of jazz, gangsters, and finance. It was a place where fortunes were made overnight. The Zhang family, seeing her transformation, no longer treated her as the abandoned sister. Her brothers, now powerful government ministers and bankers, saw her potential. She didn't need charity. She needed a platform. She started teaching German at Suzhou University, a prestigious position. But her destiny was bigger than a classroom. In 1927, the Shanghai Women's Commercial Savings Bank was in crisis. It was failing. The board of directors was looking for someone to save it. They needed someone trustworthy, someone disciplined, someone with connections. They turned to Zhang Youyi. She walked into the bank not as a figurehead, but as a boss. The bank was a mess. The staff were lazy. The books were disorganized. Zhang Youyi applied the Prussian discipline she had learned in Germany. She moved her office to the back of the bank so she could watch the tellers. She arrived earlier than anyone else. She demanded precision. Then came her moment of brilliance. 1927 was a year of violent political upheaval in China. The nationalists were marching. Warlords were fighting. Panic swept the financial markets. Most bankers were terrified. They stopped lending. They hoarded gold. They bet that the government would collapse. Zhang Youyi looked at the chaos and saw a pattern. She analyzed the political landscape with the cold logic of a strategist. She bet that the Chiang Kai-shek government would stabilize. While other banks were selling government bonds, she bought them. She bought everything she could. It was a massive gamble, and she was right. The government stabilized. The bonds skyrocketed in value. Her bank didn't just survive. It became one of the most profitable institutions in Shanghai. The country bumpkin had just outplayed the financial elite of China. She didn't stop there. Remember the insult? Small feet do not match a Western suit. Zhang Youyi decided to own the suit. She founded the Yunsheng Fashion Company, the first high-end fashion house in China. She became the general manager. She imported designs from Paris and London. She dictated what the elite women of Shanghai wore. The irony is delicious. The woman mocked for her lack of style became the woman who defined style for the entire nation. By the early 1930s, Zhang Youyi was a tycoon. She was wealthy, respected, and powerful. She bought a mansion. She had servants. She was the matriarch of her family. Chapter 4. The Ultimate Revenge. Now, we reach the most psychologically fascinating part of the story. While Zhang Youyi was ascending to the heavens, Xu Zhimo was falling to earth. Xu Zhimo had married his dream girl, Lu Xiuman. She was beautiful, artistic, and modern. She was everything he thought he wanted, but reality hit hard. Lu Xiuman was high maintenance. She refused to work. She lived a life of decadence, spending fortunes on clothes, parties, and eventually, opium. She became addicted to the drug. Her health failed. Her temper worsened. Xu Zhimo, the great free spirit, became a slave to her debts. To pay for her lifestyle, the famous poet had to hustle. He took 3 teaching jobs at different universities. He became a real estate broker on the side. He was constantly traveling, constantly borrowing money, constantly exhausted. His free love had become a prison of debt. And who did he turn to when he was desperate? Zhang Youyi. It is almost Shakespearean. The man who abandoned her for being useless was now coming to her for financial advice and help. Xu Zhimo's parents hated Liu Shaoman. They refused to give their son money because they knew his new wife would smoke it away in opium pipes. Instead, they entrusted their entire fortune to Zhang Youyi. They told Xu, "If you need money, ask your ex-wife. She is the only one we trust." Imagine the scene: Xu Zhimo, wearing a frayed suit, sitting in the opulent office of Zhang Youyi, the vice president of the bank. He has to ask her for money to support the woman he left her for. Most people would have taken this opportunity to humiliate him, to say, "I told you so," to kick him out. Zhang Youyi did not. She helped him. She invested his money. She managed his debts. She even made clothes for his parents. Why? Was she weak? Was she a doormat? Absolutely not. This was a power move. In relationships, the person who needs help is in the weaker position. A person who gives help is in the position of power. By helping him without complaint, without anger, she established her dominance. She showed that she was the adult, and he was the child. She showed that his betrayal had not broken her. It had made her untouchable. This is the ultimate revenge, to be doing so well that you can afford to pity the person who hurt you. November 19th, 1931. Xu Zhimo needed to get from Shanghai to Beijing. He was broke. He couldn't afford a ticket. He used his connections to get a free seat on a mail plane, a small, dangerous aircraft delivering postal mail. He was flying to attend a lecture given by his old love, Lin Huiyan. The plane ran into thick fog near Jinan. It crashed into a mountain. The pilot and Xu Zhimo were killed instantly. He was only 34. The news hit Shanghai like a bomb. Liu Shaoman, his wife, collapsed. She refused to believe it. She refused to go identify the body. She was useless in the crisis. The phone rang in Zhang Youyi's office. Who took charge? Zhang Youyi. She calmly instructed her son, now 13 years old, to go identify the body. She arranged the transport of the coffin. She organized the funeral. She stood at the funeral, not as the grieving widow, but as the organizer, the director. After the funeral, the world expected Zhang Youyi to walk away. Xu was dead. Her obligation was over. But she did something that shocked everyone. She found out that Liu Shaoman, the opium-addicted widow, was destitute. She had no skills, no money, and no one to help her. Zhang Youyi decided to send her a monthly allowance. She supported the woman who destroyed her marriage for years. Why? When asked, Zhang Youyi said simply, "She was Zhimo's wife. It is what he would have wanted. I do it for him, not for her." This act of grace supporting her enemy was her final victory over the past. She refused to let the pettiness of a love triangle define her character. She acted according to her own code of honor. Let us fast forward to 1988, New York City. In a quiet apartment, an old woman sits by the window. She is 97 years old. Her hair is snow white, her face mapped with the lines of a century. This is Zhang Youyi. She lived long enough to see empires rise and fall, wars begin and end. She outlived Xu Zhimo by more than 50 years. She outlived Liu Shaoman. She outlived Lin Huiyan. Her niece is sitting with her, writing a book about her life. The niece asks the question we all want to ask. "Auntie, did you love him? Did you love Xu Zhimo?" Zhang Youyi pauses. She looks at her hands that signed a divorce decree, hands that counted potatoes in Berlin, hands that counted millions in Shanghai. She answers slowly, "I was confused. Everyone told me I should love him. But looking back, I think I am the only woman who truly loved him." The niece is surprised. Why? Because, Zhang says, Liu Shaoman loved the excitement he gave her. Lin Huiyan loved the poetic adoration he gave her. But I was the only one who didn't ask him to be anything other than what he was. And I was the only one who cleaned up the mess he left behind. And then she delivers her final verdict on her life. I never regret the divorce. If I hadn't been divorced, I would have spent my life as a shadow. The divorce forced me to find my own feet. I lost a husband, but I found myself. She died peacefully shortly after, at age 88. So, what do we take away from the life of Zhang Youyi? Her story is not just a biography. It is a survival guide for the modern soul. First, Zhang Youyi teaches us that freedom is not an escape. It is a construction project. Xu Zhimo thought freedom was running away, running from marriage, running from tradition. But he was never free. He was always a slave to his passions and his debts. Zhang Youyi showed us that true freedom is competence. It is the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, to pay your own bills, to speak a foreign language, to solve your own problems. Freedom isn't given to you by a piece of paper. It is built by your own hands. Second, resilience is quiet. We often think resilience is screaming at the world. But Zhang Youyi teaches us that resilience is silence. It is counting potatoes in a cold kitchen. It is showing up to work at 9 a.m. when your heart is broken. It is the quiet dignity of continuing to live when life gives you every reason to quit. And finally, the best revenge is indifference. Zhang Youyi didn't waste her energy hating Xu Zhimo or Lu Shaman. Hate is a heavy chain. By forgiving them and even helping them, she cut the chain. She proved that her happiness did not depend on their misery. She rose so high that their actions could no longer touch her. Life is like a robe, as the famous Chinese saying goes. Some people, like Xu Zhimo, are the beautiful silk on the outside, flashy, romantic, admired. But Zhang Youyi, she was the lining, the stitching, the fabric that holds the robe together. The silk may fade, but the stitching endures. We all have moments where we feel like the country bumpkin, rejected, undervalued, left behind. When that happens, remember Zhang Youyi. Don't chase the poet who rejected you. Become the banker who owns the bank. This is Fanko Decodes. If Zhang Youyi's story gave you strength today, please like, comment, and share. Let me know in the comments. What is the biggest challenge you have had to rebuild your life from? Until next time, keep decoding your life. Stay strong.